Blood never belongs on a fence post. Not out here where the land wakes slow and quiet, where a man can spend half his life trying to forget the world that broke him, and the land does not ask questions. That morning, when the sun was still low and the air carried the chill of night, Caleb Thorne saw a dark red streak drying along the weathered wood, and it stopped him in the middle of his ride. He reined in his horse and stared at it longer than a man should stare at anything so small. The plains around him were still, broken only by wind whispering through, sagebrush in the soft groan of saddle leather settling under his weight. Silence like that had been his companion for 12 long years, and it had taught him to notice what did not belong. Caleb was 52, his face carved deep by sun, dust, and the kind of years that wear a man down quietly. Living alone on this patch of land had shaped him into someone who liked his days predictable and his company non-existent. Yet there he stood, looking at blood where blood had no right to be. He swung down from the saddle, boots hitting the dry earth with a dull thud, and crouched near the post. The streak was fresh enough to tell him it had happened after sunrise, fresh enough to mean trouble had already crossed his land. The trail continued, faint but certain, leading toward the far stretch of his field, the part people avoided unless they were lost or desperate. Caleb straightened, slid his rifle into his hand, and followed. Each step kicked up dust that clung to his boots. He moved with the care of a man who had learned that haste made mistakes permanent. Then he saw her. She lay crumpled near the fence line, half hidden by tall grass bent beneath her weight. Her dress was torn and dark with dirt, her hair tangled against her face, and her breathing came in shallow, uneven pulls like someone who had outrun their strength by miles. One hand clutched her side where blood soaked through the fabric. The other dragged weakly through the dust, as if even now she was trying to crawl away from something unseen. Caleb slowed, heart heavy, approaching her the way a man approaches a wounded animal that might still bite out of fear alone. Her eyelids fluttered. When they opened, he saw green eyes dulled by pain and dust, eyes that locked onto him with the sharp instinct of someone who had been hunted. He knelt, his shadow falling across her face, and she flinched as though darkness frightened her more than daylight ever could. She tried to speak. The first breath broke in her chest. The second carried a whisper so faint he almost missed it. "Please do not take me back." The words struck him somewhere deep and solid, a place he believed had turned to stone long ago. Caleb had heard fear before. He had heard lies, bargaining, and desperation in all its shapes. This was none of those. This was a plea torn straight from survival. He scanned the land, eyes moving across distant hills and open sky. Fear like this did not arrive alone. It came on horseback, armed and determined. He looked back at her trembling fingers, the grit clinging to sweat on her skin, and the raw will it must have taken to reach his land at all. He did not need to know her story to understand the danger. Some threats announce themselves. Some you feel before you see them. Others collapse bleeding at your fence line. Caleb bent and lifted her carefully, mindful of the wound at her side. She weighed less than he expected, the lightness of someone who had traveled too far with too little, food and too much terror. Her breath brushed his shirt as he carried her toward the cabin that had been his only company for more than a decade. Inside, he laid her on the narrow cot by the window. The room smelled of dry wood, old tobacco, and faint coffee left on the stove too long ago. It was the smell of a quiet life, and that life was cracking open. He filled a basin with water, tore clean cloth into strips, and uncorked a bottle of whiskey saved for cold nights and older memories. He cleaned the dirt from her wound while she clenched her jaw, refusing to cry out. That told him more than words. When her eyes opened again, they were clearer, though rimmed with exhaustion. She studied him the way people study the edge of a blade, deciding which side would cut. He worked in silence. Speaking too soon rarely helped. After a while, she whispered a thin thank you, fingers clutching the blanket as if it anchored her to the world. Caleb nodded once. "You ran a long way," he said. "Someone was chasing you." The question hung heavy. She swallowed. "Yes, they will not stop. Not until they finish what they started." He leaned back on the stool, memories stirring that he had buried deep. He had seen this fear before, years ago, when men with guns answered only to greed. What did they start? His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. She closed her eyes briefly, gathering strength. My name is Lena Carter. My family had a small claim near Silver Mesa. We found a vein of ore, richer than anything we had ever seen. Word spread too fast. A man named Cole Maddox wanted it. Foreman at the mining camp. He sent his hired guns one night. They said they only wanted to talk. Her voice broke. They never want to talk. They took the claim. They took everything. I ran when they thought I was dead. Now they want to finish it so no one knows. Caleb listened, unmoving. Outside, a crow called from the fence line, and the stillness felt like the breath before a storm. If she spoke truth, then trouble was already close. Caleb rose and went to the door, opening it just enough to study the land. Nothing moved but wind. When he turned back, Lena's eyes were on him. Do you think they found my trail? If they want you this bad, they will follow dust itself. He pulled back the rug and lifted the trap door beneath. The hinges complained softly. You will be safe down there until I know what is coming. She hesitated. You cannot face them alone. He met her gaze. I have been alone long enough to know what I can handle. She climbed down and he sealed the floor again just as a sound reached his ears. Hoofbeats, distant but steady. Caleb stepped to the window and saw 4 riders crest the far ridge, moving with purpose. Men hired to finish work. One dismounted near the fence, studying the ground. When he pointed toward the cabin, Caleb knew the moment had arrived. He stepped onto the porch as the riders approached, rifle loose in his hands. We are hunting a thief, the lead man called. She ran through here. We just want to ask questions. This land does not get visitors, Caleb replied. You will not find her. They were not leaving. When the floorboard creaked behind him, the lead rider reached for his pistol, and Caleb moved first. The rifles cracked, tearing the morning apart. The rifle's report shattered. The quiet so completely it felt as though the land itself flinched. The lead rider was already moving when the shot caught him, but not fast enough. The impact snapped him backward out of the saddle, his body folding in on itself before hitting the dirt with a sound that carried farther than the gunfire. For a fraction of a second, everything froze. Dust hung in the air. Horses screamed and reared. Then the morning exploded. The remaining riders reacted on instinct. Years of violence guiding their hands faster than thought. Pistols cleared leather. Rifles came up. Bullets tore through the air, chewing splinters from porch posts and sending shards of dry wood spinning. Caleb dropped behind the porch rail as rounds punched holes where his chest had been moments earlier. He worked the lever of his rifle smoothly, fired once more, then shifted position before return fire ripped through the spot he'd occupied. Age had slowed his joints but sharpened his judgment. He did not waste movement. Each breath was measured. Each shot counted. Inside the cabin, a muffled cry told him Lena had heard everything. The sound twisted in his chest, but he pushed it aside. Fear had no place here. If she panicked now, the trap door might as well have been open. 2 riders scrambled for cover behind the old water trough, knocking it over as they went, muddy water spilling into the dirt. Another moved toward the barn, pressing himself against the weathered boards, firing short, controlled bursts meant to keep Caleb pinned. The 4th lay motionless near the fence, blood darkening the soil beneath him. Caleb counted shots by sound alone, tracking who fired when, how often, how close they were inching. The barn wall rider was disciplined. The men at the trough were loud, panicked. That told him everything he needed to know. He waited for a brief lull, then slipped off the porch and ran low along the side of the cabin, boots pounding once, twice, before he disappeared from their line of sight. Shouts followed. Gunfire stitched the air behind him, but none found flesh. Caleb reached the barn and ducked. Inside, breath burning in his chest. The smell of old hay and oil wrapped around him. Sunlight cut through the cracks in the boards, striping the dirt floor. He knelt behind a stack of crates, hands steady as he scanned his surroundings. This place held remnants of another life. Another job he'd once taken when the world still expected things from him. His gaze landed on a small wooden box pushed against the far wall. He crossed to it, pried it open, and found what he'd hoped was still there. 1 stick of mining explosive wrapped in yellowed paper. He stared at it for a heartbeat longer than necessary. He had meant to throw it away years ago, but some part of him had known better. Caleb pulled his lighter from his pocket, thumb hovering. Outside, gunfire cracked again, closer now. He struck the flame, lit the fuse, and whispered a prayer he hadn't spoken in years. Then he rolled the explosive across the dirt toward the trough. It bounced once, twice, disappeared behind the overturned wood. A split second later, the blast roared through the air. The shockwave slammed into the barn wall, rattling boards and shaking dust loose from the rafters. The trough shattered into fragments. Dirt, water, and smoke erupted skyward. When the air cleared, one rider lay still, twisted at an unnatural angle. The other crawled away, dragging a leg that refused to work, leaving a dark trail behind him. The man at the barn wall stared, shock wide in his eyes. He hesitated, then made his choice. He threw his gun down, scrambled onto his horse, and rode hard for the hills, fear finally louder than orders. Silence crept back in, broken only by the labored breathing of the wounded man and the distant thunder of retreating hooves. Caleb stepped out from the barn, rifle still raised, scanning for movement. When he was sure it was done, he walked back toward the cabin. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of what he'd unleashed settling into his bones. Lena pushed the door open slowly. She was pale, shaking but standing. Her eyes darted to the bodies, then back to him. "Is it over?" "For now," Caleb said. He knew better than to believe violence ended cleanly. He helped her back to the cot and checked her wound again. It had stopped bleeding, but she was weak, exhaustion pulling at her hard. She gripped his sleeve. "If they know I'm alive, they will come back. For both of us." He met her gaze, unwavering. "They already know enough. The difference is whether they come as shadows or as men who answer to the law." At first light, he saddled his horse and rode for town, leaving Lena hidden and guarded by the silence of the plains. The ride was long, the road familiar but heavy with purpose. In town, he spoke to the sheriff, then to the county men who still believed in doing their jobs. He told them everything. About Silver Mesa, about Cole Maddox, about blood on a fence post. When they rode out days later, badges glinting in the sun, the land felt different, lighter. The truth had a way of doing that. Lena told her story. This time, men listened. When it was done, Caleb returned to his ranch. He fixed his fence in the evenings while Lena sat on the porch, healing in the sun. The quiet came back, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was honest. He had spent 12 years hiding from the world. One stranger had reminded him that a man isn't meant to carry his past forever. Sometimes he has to stand up again. The days that followed moved slower than the gunfight, but carried a different kind of weight, the kind that settles into the bones and reminds a man that survival is only the beginning of reckoning. The ranch no longer felt like a place suspended outside the world. Tracks cut the dirt where riders had stood. Broken wood lay scattered near the porch. The land remembered violence even when it pretended not to. Caleb woke each morning before sunrise out of habit, listening for sounds that did not belong. Wind, birds, the soft shift of the house settling. Each noise was measured, tested, dismissed. Only then would he move. Lena healed slowly. The wound at her side closed little by little, but exhaustion lingered in her eyes. She spent long hours sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the plains as if expecting men to rise from the grass at any moment. Caleb did not ask her questions she was not ready to answer. Some stories needed time to loosen their grip. He fixed the fence where blood had dried, scraping the wood clean with a blade until the stain was gone. Still, he remembered exactly where it had been. At night, when the land went quiet again, memories crept in, not just of the gunfight, but of other days, other men, other choices. He had not picked up a rifle in anger for years. The act had woken something he thought he'd buried with the past. Lena noticed the way his hands tightened sometimes, the way his gaze drifted far beyond the horizon. One evening, as the sun sank red and low, she spoke softly. "You didn't have to do this for me." Caleb kept his eyes on the fence post he was mending. Sometimes, he said, a man does things because not doing them costs more. She nodded, understanding more than he expected. The officials returned sooner than either of them thought. Horses, badges, papers. They searched the land, examined the bodies, asked careful questions. Caleb answered plainly. Lena spoke when she could, her voice steadier than before. Cole Maddox's name carried weight, but not enough to shield him anymore. Greed had finally outrun his influence. When the men rode away again, dust trailing behind them, the ranch fell quiet once more. Days passed. Then weeks. Lena grew stronger, helping with small chores. Her presence filling spaces Caleb had grown used to leaving empty. The evenings changed. Conversations stretched longer. Silence felt less heavy. Yet unease lingered, a sense that the story had not fully closed. Trouble like that rarely ended without one last test. Caleb felt it the morning he noticed tracks again near the far ridge. Old tracks, half erased but deliberate. Someone had come close enough to look. He followed them until they vanished into rock and scrub. Whoever it was had chosen not to be seen. That night, he told Lena they would ride to town together at first light. She protested, fear tightening her voice. He shook his head. Hiding ends eventually. Better to face daylight on your feet than shadows on your knees. They rode side by side, the road stretching ahead, carrying more than just distance. In town, word had already spread. Cole Maddox was under arrest. His hired men were being named, tracked, brought in. The claim at Silver Mesa was being investigated. The ore tested, the theft documented. Lena stood straighter with every word she heard. For the first time since Caleb had found her, something like hope settled on her face. When they returned to the ranch, the land felt changed again. Not healed, but closer. Caleb knew the quiet would never be what it had been, and he realized he no longer wanted it to be. He had stood between violence and innocence once more, and the world had not broken him for it. It had reminded him who he was beneath the silence. The hardest part came one evening when Lena spoke the question neither of them had voiced. What happens now? Caleb looked out over the plains, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows. We live, he said, and we don't look away anymore. The morning the officials returned for the last time, the land seemed to know it. The wind lay low, the sky stretched wide and pale, and the ranch rested in a stillness that felt earned rather than empty. Caleb stood on the porch with his hands hooked in his belt, watching the road long before the riders appeared. When they did, dust trailing behind them, there was no tension in his chest this time, only weight, the kind that comes when a story is finally ready to be carried away. Lena stepped out beside him, walking steadier now, the color back in her face. She had changed clothes, but the woman who had crawled bleeding across his field still lived in her eyes. The sheriff dismounted, nodded once, and spoke without ceremony. Cole Maddox was done. The claim at Silver Mesa had been seized back into lawful hands. What was left of her family's rights would be honored. The hired men who survived had talked. Men always talked when the rope came into view. Lena closed her eyes when she heard it, one hand rising to her mouth, not in grief this time, but in release. When she opened them again, tears ran freely down her cheeks, and she did not bother to hide them. Caleb watched quietly. He had seen justice come late before. He knew better than to celebrate it too loudly. But seeing it arrive at all still mattered. When the officials rode away, the dust settled slowly, and the ranch stood alone again. But not as it had been. The days that followed were gentler. Lena healed fully, the wound at her side leaving only a thin scar, and a deeper memory. She helped mend fence, learned the rhythms of the land, and laughed sometimes, surprised by the sound of it herself. Caleb found his routines shifting without resistance. He cooked more than he used to. He spoke more. Silence still lived there, but it no longer ruled him. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the plains gold, Lena sat on the porch steps and asked him why he had stayed alone so long. Caleb did not answer right away. He watched the horizon, the way the light softened everything it touched. Because I thought quiet meant peace, he finally said. Turns out it was just hiding. She nodded, understanding in her own way. The fence where he had first seen the blood stood repaired now, clean wood catching the light. He paused there sometimes, remembering how close the world had come to passing him by again. If he had ridden faster that morning, if he had looked away, the thought stayed with him, not as regret, but as a reminder. The land teaches lessons slowly, but it teaches them true. Weeks later, Lena told him she planned to leave, to return to Silver Mesa and rebuild what could be rebuilt. The words struck deeper than he expected. He helped her pack without argument. On the morning she rode out, she stopped at the fence line and looked back at him. "You changed my life," she said. Caleb shook his head. "You reminded me how to live in it." She smiled, then turned her horse toward the rising sun. Caleb watched until she was a small shape against the open land. Then nothing at all. The quiet returned, but it felt different now. Not lonely, not heavy, just honest. He repaired his fence in the evenings, drank his coffee slow in the mornings, and let the world exist around him again. He had spent 12 years believing the hardest road was the one that led away from pain. He had been wrong. Sometimes the hardest road is the one that leads back to people, back to truth, back to standing when it would be easier to turn away. Blood never belongs on a fence post, but sometimes when it appears, it reminds a man of who he still is. And when life brings someone broken to your door, the choice you make echoes longer than the gunfire ever will. If this story stayed with you even a little, give it a like. It helps more than you think. And if you want more journeys across the Old West, feel free to subscribe and ride along with the next tale.